Hello, welcome to ME 510, Economics and Policy of Engineered Energy Systems. This presentation is the first part of a four-part module that focuses on the origins of fossil capital. This topic consists of excerpts from the article by Andreas Malm focusing on the Industrial Revolution in England. This background information will help us understand the interrelationships between energy systems and social and political changes within the British context. We started our presentation by talking about John Tyndall, a scientist from the 19th century. John Tyndall was interested in understanding how gas could trap heat rays. For this effort, he ascended into one of the high mountaintops in the region in order to study the composition of the atmosphere and look at the temperature. Now, based on his calculations, he found that cutting the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere could lower the temperature in Europe. Now, John wasn't particularly interested in the concept of global warming, which was not known or discussed much at the time, but it was his research that started to point towards the influence of CO2 in increasing global temperatures. And as with many scientific discoveries, this notion was simply a side note for his search of understanding how ice ages occurred. Now, this is relevant because during that time, we saw a significant rise in the use of coal in England. This is the hallmark of the Industrial Revolution. And you can see in this graph that coal use dominated in England from the 1800s all the way to the 1950s and even 60s. It wasn't until after the 1960s when we see petroleum take over and later on natural gas overcome the consumption of coal. Now we know that worldwide coal has had a couple difficult years and its use has seen some significant declines, particularly in Western civilizations. But it still remains a predominant source of energy worldwide. Now, just to show how significant the use of coal was to the British economy, in this chart, you can see on one line the retail price index. This is a financial indicator of how consumer prices are varying over time. And you can see that there are particular points in time, for example, 1870 or so, when spikes in the price of coal resulted in spikes in the retail price index. So certainly, even as late as 1920, you can see that there is a strong correlation, or at least there are significant trends that correlate between the two in terms of the role of coal in indicating how the retail price index will behave. So certainly this speaks to the interplay between energy and consumer markets. Now, why did coal become so important? Well, you might have heard of James Watt. James Watt was an inventor. And at the time, his greatest invention, possibly his greatest invention, was the steam engine. James Watt invented the steam engine in great part to replace cotton mills, which were a major part of the British industry at the time. Cotton mills at the time had to operate near a water source because they were essentially using hydropower to run their engines. And that had some very important social and economic implications. The cotton mills had to be located again near rivers. These rivers were often very far from urban areas. And so their labor had to usually relocate to those locations. And so you see that some of the landscape in England was shaped by these cotton mills. There were towns being formed around the laborers that worked for these cotton mills. What James Watt did with his engine is in a way democratize the production of the location of cotton mills. By using coal instead of water power, cotton mills could now locate anywhere that coal could be delivered. And so that changed the dynamics. specifically, it allowed these cotton industries to move towards urban areas where they had a much higher labor pool to pull from, which also meant more competition for labor jobs. And when there's more competition for labor jobs, then companies can lower wages, they can make it a little bit more difficult for laborers. And so it wasn't until the government came in and tried to regulate some of the struggles between the cotton mills and the laborers. And we'll see that throughout history, this is one of the different types of challenges that energy systems face with social political systems. Uh, One way to explain this phenomena is called the Ricardian curse. The Ricardian curse is the notion that countries that have significant resources do not always experience the greatest economic growth. What you see in this chart on the x-axis is the export of natural resources as a percentage of the gross domestic product. What this is indicating is if you are exporting a significant amount of natural resources, petroleum, coal, natural gas, or other types of natural resources, then you probably have a significant portion of your own. That's the assumption here. On the y-axis, we have the real gross domestic product growth per capita from 1970 to 1989. And what you see is that countries that have the highest exports of natural resources often have low, if not even negative, gross domestic product growth during this period. Kuwait here is the outlier with over 65% of its natural resources in terms of its GDP, and a very negative, almost -8 real GDP growth per capita. United Arab Emirates, another oil-rich country in a similar situation. If you go to the other extreme, you have countries like Singapore, the Republic of Korea, Hong Kong. These are countries that lack natural resources, but that have been able to experience significant economic growth during this period. At the bottom, you have a link if you're interested in reading more about the Ricardian curve. This link in particular talks about this relationship between natural resources and growth as studied by the World Bank. Part of the reason why the Ricardian curse exists is because people do not invent new methods of procurement when they're affluent. Oftentimes, it's only when we're poor or face scarcity when we work hard to discover new methods. And this is true in the energy industry. Right now, we're in a situation where global population is growing rapidly. We are projecting to surpass 9 billion people on this planet before 2050. And so we're going to need to find new energy solutions in order to feed this whole population and provide energy for their daily use. To summarize, the Industrial Revolution was Britain's response to an energy shortage which affected its economy in the second half of the 18th century. Furthermore, a population explosion intensified the need to change its energy from wood to fossilized fuel. When we talked about James Watt, we focused on the industrial side of things and the cotton mills, but this was a phenomenon that was happening nationwide. And so coal came in to replace wood. It was a higher energy density resource. It was abundant in Britain at the time. And so the population sought to use this lower cost alternative, high energy alternative to wood. But what about the cotton mills? So in the 1830s, like I said, cotton mills dominated, but the coming of coal changed their dominance. Now, one important fact about this is that even though the cotton industry and the water power industry was dominant, they were not by any way saturated. The industry was not saturated. What do I mean by this? Well, if you look at this chart here, you have the names of different rivers: Irwell, Derwent, Dove, Ribble, and Spoden. These are rivers that are found in England. And if you look at how much hydropower they had available, you will find that only a small percent of that hydropower is being utilized by the cotton industry. Spoden had the highest utilization rate at around 7%, but you have Dole, for example, with less than 1% of its hydropower being utilized. So it wasn't that the cotton industry couldn't expand by using more water power. It's just that coal was a much better alternative. In more modern times, we've had a similar issue with the oil age. So here's a famous quote by an United Arab Emirate officer that said, "The Stone Age came to an end not for a lack of stones, and the oil age will end, but not for a lack of oil." Given the current low or low oil prices globally, some people are starting to say that the end of the oil age is moving faster than expected. That may be possible, but those are the types of questions that this class hopes to give you tools to investigate and answer. To summarize again, the steam engine prevailed because it provided access to experienced labor. Cotton capital turned to steam because it offered superior power over labor. That is the social benefit of the coal industry. Now, one of the things that I want you to start thinking, not just now, but anytime we look at these issues, is what is a similar phenomenon occurring today and what are its enabling factors? So, when I talk about phenomenons, I'm talking about the social changes. So, in England, you will hear about the fight between labor and industry. And I encourage you to read the article in full to really understand what the debates were. And the enabling factor was the coal powered steam engine. This concludes the first part of this module. We will now move on to part two.